Did you know the secret relationship Princess Diana had with one of the top pop stars in the world? Get ready for this blockbuster of a video in which we tell you about the secret relationship between Princess Diana and Elton John and just why they started fighting. Under the chandeliers of Prince Andrew's 21st birthday, a young Diana Spencer moved through the crowd like a nobody who hadn't yet realized she was famous. She wasn't a princess yet, not officially, but the world already watched her every movement with quiet calculation. Across the room, Elton John noticed her long before she noticed him. The two would meet that night, two people from different worlds, but marked by the same curse. They would come to see fame not as fortune, but a form of captivity. What followed wasn't just friendship. It was a quiet rebellion against a system that devoured its own. Elton John had met royalty before. He'd performed for them, laughed with them, pretended to admire their empty manners. But Diana was different. There was no pretense in her eyes, no stiffness, no rehearsed gesture. She wasn't born into the machine. She was consumed by it. Elton saw in her what he'd seen in himself, someone the world adored but never truly listened to. In her, he saw honesty trying to survive inside an empire built on silence. Their bond formed quickly, not through glamour or charity, but through shared pain. Both had learned that attention didn't mean affection, and applause didn't mean love. When Diana would visit him privately, there were no cameras, no servants, just two people unlearning the lies of their public image. She told him about the loneliness that followed her like a shadow, how the palace walls weren't protection but punishment. Elton once said her laughter could light up the darkest room, but it was her silences that haunted him most. He would later describe her as the only real thing inside that unreal world. As their friendship deepened, the royal family grew uneasy. They didn't like outsiders who saw too much, and Elton saw everything. He saw how she was handled, how every emotion she expressed was measured against an image that wasn't hers. They wanted her polished, obedient, and voiceless. Elton wanted her free. He encouraged her to step beyond the script, to speak, to fight, to live. And that was unforgivable. What many didn't know was that the royal family's distaste for Elton wasn't about class or culture. It was about control. Elton is emotionally unpredictable and someone who doesn't play by their rules. He represented everything they feared: authenticity. And the closer Diana grew to him, the more the palace tightened its grip on her. He began to notice subtle warnings, social invitations rescinded, whispers about his influence, the quiet effort to erase him from her circle. But Elton didn't scare easily. Diana trusted him because he didn't need anything from her. He wasn't after proximity to the crown. He'd already conquered the world. What he offered her was something no one inside the palace could: truth. When she told him about the press leaks, the orchestrated betrayals, the walls closing in, Elton would listen, furious and powerless. He knew that every headline cutting her down was a blade handed by someone close to her. She once told him, "They'll destroy me before they let me be myself." He believed her. The turning point came when she began pulling away from royal handlers and shaping her own public voice. Elton was behind her quietly, reminding her that survival meant resistance. He introduced her to people outside the aristocracy, activists and friends who lived without pretense. Each step she took toward independence made the palace more defensive. They couldn't control her when she was near him, and they hated that. In private, Elton watched her transformation with both pride and fear. She was reclaiming her voice, but he knew how vindictive the monarchy could be when challenged. He'd seen their machinery up close, the press briefings, the selective leaks, the stories crafted to make her seem unstable. To them, she was never Diana the woman. She was an asset, a symbol, a problem to be managed. And when that management failed, they punished her through humiliation. He once said she was the loneliest person he'd ever met, and he meant it. In those years, he saw her unraveling under the performance of being loved. Behind the fairy tale photographs was a woman trapped between public worship and private despair. Elton knew what it was like to survive addiction, fame, and public dissection. But for Diana, the addiction wasn't to substances, it was to the idea that she could ever be free inside a family that made freedom a sin. What Elton couldn't predict was how the same system that isolated her would soon isolate him too. His closeness to Diana became a quiet threat to royal image-making. To them, he was too emotional, too flamboyant, too outspoken, and worst of all, too loyal. They didn't want loyalty, they wanted silence. The royal family's disdain for him became whispered, then visible, then absolute. Behind palace doors, his name was treated as a complication, a reminder of Diana's disobedience. Yet even as they worked to cut him out, Elton refused to betray her. He'd seen too much, and he'd promised her something few ever did: protection. When her world collapsed, when the palace moved to erase her narrative, Elton became her mirror to reality. He told her she wasn't crazy, that what was happening was deliberate, orchestrated, and he was right. By the time 1997 arrived, they were closer than ever again, two survivors of the same public machine. He thought she'd finally escaped it. But as history proved, no one escapes that easily. When Diana's name vanished from the palace calendar, Elton already knew it wasn't just distance, it was deletion. What had begun as subtle avoidance became silence carved into stone. The calls stopped being answered, invitations stopped being sent, and behind closed doors, people whispered that the friendship had become a liability. Elton knew what that meant in royal language. It meant Diana was now a danger, and anyone too close to her was to be treated the same way. Still, he couldn't quite believe it, until one morning he received the letter. It wasn't signed by her hand, but by a palace assistant, politely informing him that Her Royal Highness would not be attending the upcoming charity gala they had organized together. No reason, no warmth, no trace of the woman he once sat beside, laughing in the back seat of a car as they escaped cameras in disguise. It was the coldest confirmation of what he already feared. Someone had gotten to her. The shift had been building since 1996, when Diana began to tear down the very image that the monarchy depended on. Her divorce had freed her name, but chained her reputation. For the palace, every photo, every quote, every friend was now a potential weapon. And Elton John, known for his unfiltered mouth and worldwide reach, was the last person they wanted in her circle. The friendship had always been too visible, too real. It broke the illusion that the royal family preferred, one of quiet dignity, emotional restraint, and obedience. Diana and Elton laughed too loudly, cared too openly, and spoke too freely. In their world, that was the beginning of the end. When Versace died in July 1997, Diana called Elton in tears. They were both grieving a man who had understood them, a designer who adored glamour but saw through loneliness. It was the first time they had spoken properly in months. The emotional wall between them cracked, and for a moment, they were back to what they once were: two exiles finding safety in each other's defiance. They planned to attend the funeral together. Elton even wrote a song for Versace, a small gesture of love in a world that only wanted appearances. But what happened next deepened the cut beyond repair. Days after Versace's funeral, Diana died. The timing was too cruel, too perfect, too convenient. Elton said he felt the world fall silent that morning. He sat by the piano, numb, unable to process that the woman who had just called him days ago was now gone. The palace, caught in shock and panic, wanted order restored, not grief, not chaos. What they didn't want was Elton John turning her funeral into something raw, something human. When he offered to sing at the service, they refused. They told him his music wasn't appropriate for Westminster. He later admitted that the conversation left him trembling with rage. The same institution that had ignored Diana in life was now trying to control how she would be remembered in death. It was only when the public outrage began to swell, when people flooded the gates with flowers and letters, that the palace caved. The Queen's staff called Elton back. They needed him now, not as a friend, but as a symbol. His song, Candle in the Wind, originally written for Marilyn Monroe, was rewritten overnight. It became a farewell, not from the crown, but from the people. He walked into that cathedral, surrounded by a monarchy that had tried to erase him weeks earlier, and yet he sang for the one they couldn't silence anymore. When he finished, there wasn't a single sound in the hall. The Queen remained still. Prince Charles stared ahead, and Elton, in front of the entire world, realized he had been used. It was the one final performance to calm the public before they sealed Diana's story away forever. After the funeral, he was escorted out of royal correspondence entirely. No thank you, no letter, no acknowledgement, just the quiet message that he was no longer welcome. Years later, he would say that it was the worst kind of betrayal, not by Diana, but by the people who had destroyed her and now wanted her death to be remembered on their terms. The same people who had forced her into silence had now turned her into an emblem of tragedy they could control. And Elton John, the man who had stood at her side when the rest turned their backs, had become inconvenient once again. But behind the grief was another wound. He had been warned weeks before her death. A friend inside the palace had told him not to get involved, not to push back against what was happening. The warnings had come quietly, that Diana was being watched, that her movements were known, that she had made too many enemies. Elton dismissed it as paranoia, the same rumor mill that always swirled around the royals. But after that night in Paris, those words replayed endlessly in his mind. He wondered if the truth had been in front of him all along, that the same system which silenced her friendship might have done far worse to her freedom. And as the cameras moved on and the palace reclaimed its order, Elton's silence became his rebellion. He never again performed for the monarchy. He refused their offers of reconciliation. To the world, he remained polite, but in private, the fury lingered. He had seen too much, not just the death of his friend, but the machinery that followed it. The transformation of Diana from a woman into a weapon, then into a saint, then finally into a story the royals could live with. But Elton John couldn't live with it, because beneath all the tributes, the carefully chosen words, and the endless documentaries, he knew one thing the palace could never admit. Her death was not the end of the story. It was the moment they began rewriting it. In the months after Diana's death, Elton stopped speaking to anyone connected to the palace. Not out of anger at first, but out of disbelief. He had spent years performing for royal causes, dining at their tables, calling them friends. Now, he could barely stomach their faces on television. The same family that had cast Diana out was now parading her memory for sympathy. They were reading speeches about compassion, holding vigils for a woman they had called unstable, difficult, and dangerous. Elton said it felt like watching actors recite lines they didn't believe. And the worst part was knowing that Diana would have hated it. Every word, every stage gesture, every royal wreath carefully placed for the cameras. He began refusing appearances that involved them. Invitations arrived and went unanswered. Charity organizers were warned not to list him if the event was under royal patronage. It didn't matter. Elton had already made up his mind. His loyalty wasn't to the crown anymore, it was to the truth. And that truth had become unbearable to look at. In interviews, he kept his tone careful, never directly accusing, but the cracks were visible. When he said they didn't know how to deal with her, everyone knew who they were. He wasn't talking about the press. He was talking about the institution that had fed the press, manipulated it, and then pretended to mourn what it had created. Behind the scenes, the palace wanted control over Elton's image. They couldn't silence him completely, so they tried to manage him. Aides approached him quietly, suggesting it was time to move forward. One even hinted at a royal honor, a way of mending fences. Elton declined it all. He didn't need forgiveness from a family that had buried Diana's truth under ceremony and stone. When he released Candle in the Wind, 1997, every note was a reminder that the song wasn't written for them. It was written in defiance of them. What they didn't expect was how the world would respond. The single became the best-selling record in history, and for the first time, the monarchy had been outshone by a song. It terrified them. Elton saw how the palace moved quickly after that. They started reshaping the narrative, reclaiming Diana as their own. Suddenly, she wasn't the rebel who defied them. She was the lost princess they had loved all along. Official documentaries softened her edges. Public statements painted her as misunderstood, and palace-approved biographers quietly removed the tension from her story. It was revisionism disguised as tribute. Elton kept quiet, but he saw it happening in real time. Every trace of conflict was being erased. Every uncomfortable truth was being rewritten. He remembered the last private conversation they ever had. It was in 1997, after a small charity dinner. Diana had confided that she was scared, not for her life, but for her control. She said that no matter how far she ran from the palace, they always found a way to pull the strings. Elton thought she was exaggerating, but now those words haunted him. The way she had started talking about being watched, the way her staff were replaced, the way stories leaked before she told anyone. It was as if she were living under invisible supervision, and he had laughed it off as paranoia. After her death, he realized that what she described wasn't madness, it was monarchy. What hurt him most wasn't her absence, but the way they used it. Within months, the same men who once called her a threat to stability were naming hospitals and charities after her. Prince Charles, the man who had once let her take the blame for everything, was being publicly pitied. The Queen, who had ignored her calls during the final week of her life, was now the grieving matriarch. The hypocrisy was suffocating, and Elton, who had actually known her heart, was now watching strangers define it for profit. When he spoke at small events, he began to say more than he was supposed to. He called the palace cold. He called the media accomplices. He called the treatment of Diana cruel beyond measure. The royal press office began blacklisting him quietly. His name disappeared from state concerts. They didn't want confrontation. They wanted compliance. But Elton wasn't afraid anymore. He had already lost his friend. There was nothing left to protect. In later years, when Harry and Meghan began speaking about their own experience, Elton reached out privately. He saw the same signs, the same machinery working behind the curtains. He offered them his home as a place of safety, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed. Tabloids called him biased. Palace sources hinted that he was still emotional about Diana, but Elton didn't care. He said what no royal insider dared to say, that nothing had changed. The system that destroyed Diana was still alive, only better at hiding it. Years after the cameras faded and the headlines changed, Elton began to understand what silence really cost. The royals had rebuilt their image. Time had softened their faces. The scandals rebranded as lessons. The grief converted into a legacy. But nothing about it was honest. Diana had been turned into a saint to protect the very people who destroyed her. And Elton, once dismissed as an emotional outsider, had become one of the last witnesses left who remembered what really happened: the cruelty, the manipulation, the quiet punishments that followed anyone who dared to care for her. When he spoke about her decades later, his words carried the exhaustion of someone who had seen how truth gets buried. He called her the greatest heart I ever knew. But what he meant was that she was the one person inside that world who still acted human, and the palace had no place for humanity. He revealed that the rift between them, the months of silence before her death, hadn't been caused by argument, but by interference. Someone inside the royal circle had deliberately fed her false stories about him, convincing her he had been mocking her behind her back. Elton said he didn't believe it until he saw the letters himself, written in a tone that wasn't hers, words that read like they had been dictated. He knew immediately she hadn't written them freely. She had written them under pressure. It was the palace's favorite tactic: isolation. They had done it to her marriage, to her charities, and finally, to her friendships. By the end, she was surrounded by people who answered to someone else. Elton once described it as watching them erase her in real time. They couldn't silence her voice, so they silenced the people around her. And when she was gone, they acted as if none of it had ever happened. When the news broke that she had died in a car crash in Paris, he felt the same disbelief that millions did, but beneath it, he felt recognition. The palace didn't just inherit her death, it needed it. Because in life, Diana was uncontrollable. In death, she was perfect. They could finally love her safely, finally claim her story without her correcting them. And they did. Every commemoration, every royal documentary, every statue, all carefully edited to fit their version of events. It was a triumph of control disguised as tribute. Elton, for all his fury, learned to play their game too. He stayed polite in interviews, knowing how far he could go before they came for him again. But inside, the bitterness never faded. He once told a friend that nothing in that family happens by accident. It was a sentence that said everything. The timing of Diana's death, the management of the aftermath, the calculated calm that followed, it was all too precise. He never claimed to know what happened that night in Paris, but he knew the pattern. When the monarchy is threatened, it always survives. The question is who doesn't. By the time he finally retired from touring, Elton had come to accept what Diana had tried to tell him, that kindness and truth have no place inside walls built on image. He said she had been right about everything: the fear, the control, the loneliness. And what haunted him most was knowing she never lived to see herself vindicated. The monarchy survived, just as it always does, but something inside its facade broke the day she died. The public saw behind the curtain for the first time, and what they saw couldn't be unseen. In his final interviews, Elton never mentioned the palace by name. He didn't have to. Every word was lined with contempt. He called Diana the last person who reminded them what being royal was supposed to mean. And when asked if he believed her death was truly accidental, he paused for a long time before saying, "I believe what we were told to believe." That's all I can say. It was as close to a confession as he would ever make, not of guilt, but of knowledge. That behind the fairy tale, behind the immaculate smiles, there was a system that had consumed its brightest soul and then pretended to mourn her. The truth, he knew, would never be spoken from inside those gates. But he had sung it once in a cathedral full of liars, and the world had listened. And that, he said, was enough. Because the monarchy could erase letters, destroy tapes, silence witnesses, but it couldn't erase the sound of that song echoing through Westminster Abbey. For a single moment, they had to stand still while the world grieved the woman they had buried long before her funeral. That was Diana's final victory, and Elton John's quiet revenge. Verified accounts confirm Elton John and Princess Diana shared a deep friendship, strained briefly before her death, and rekindled after Versace's funeral. Elton's performance of Candle in the Wind, 1997, at her funeral remains one of the most watched and best-selling tributes in history. The rest, the interference, the manipulation, the whispers of surveillance, remains unproven. The palace has never commented, and perhaps that silence says more